It's good to be back. Now, some of you have already asked me what I think about the election in the United States this week. And for now, my answer is, I don't want to talk about it. If I were to talk about it today, it would almost inevitably lead to more cussing than I like to do in church on a Sunday. And I have spent the last 25 years or so trying desperately not to drop any F-bombs in the pulpit, and I'd kind of like to maintain that record for now. I will say, however, that the passage that Robert read from Psalm 136 actually has nothing whatsoever to do with the rest of my sermon today. I basically inserted it into our service for that one line, "Do not put your trust in princes." Enough said. So, suffice it to say, though, that if I were preaching today in the United States, it would be a very different sermon, and I just pray I never have to preach that sermon here. Can I get an amen? Amen. Okay. On the subject of the current news cycle, I offer you this advice from the place where I find a lot of my best theology, memes on Facebook. And this is it. If you want evidence that the world is a terrible place, read the news and surf the web. If you want to remember how incredibly beautiful the world is, go out into nature. Because unlike social media and in the news, nature has no incentive to keep us agitated, angry, and afraid. And that's my advice for today. Okay, so on to today's sermon. You can start the timer now. So one of the things that has always impressed me most as an American transplanted to Canada is the way that Canadians celebrate Remembrance Day. In fact, I would say that it was one of the things that first marked to me a big difference between American and Canadian societies, American and Canadian cultures. And in some ways, in my humble opinion, and actually I really do offer this opinion humbly as an American who did not grow up learning Canadian history, I'm trying to catch up, the biggest differences between the two cultures stems from policies the two countries adopted in the 60s and 70s. In the 1960s, the United States kind of resolved to build what was called the Great Society, which it basically defined in purely economic terms. And around the same time, Canada resolved to become a just society, which it defined in multicultural terms. And it's kind of one of the things that I love most about Canadian culture. And believe me, as an outsider looking in from the perspective of what America has become, Canada chose the better part. And I pray that it never loses sight of that. It is really important to remember that. The Spanish philosopher George Santayana famously said, "Those who do not remember the past are doomed to repeat it." And one of the things I love, particularly as a student of history, about the way that Canadians celebrate Remembrance Day is that Canadians remember really well. And it's not lost on me that Remembrance Day, which was once called Armistice Day, celebrates an event that took place well before the living memory of anyone now alive. What we remember on November 11th is the end of the Great War, World War I, which ended at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month in 1918. Any idea why that was so precise? The armistice was signed at precisely that hour on that day, precisely so people would remember. I mean, 11/11/11, we remember, and we do. And it was over 100 years ago, long before anyone here was born. And yet, we remember. because those memories have been preserved and passed down to us through the generations. And our elders' memories have become our memories, and they live on in us. My grandfather was in the United States Army in the First World War, so I have that little personal tie to our history, although he never, ever talked about it. And some of you probably have grandfathers or great-grandfathers or great-uncles who fought in the hope that we would never fight like that again. Oh well. But we still remember. And I don't know if you all know this, but we don't do Remembrance Day in the United States. In the U.S., November 11th is called Veterans Day, when military service members are honored. And once upon a time, the U.S. did celebrate Remembrance Day, but in 1954, for some reason, they changed it to Veterans Day. And while I think it is lovely to celebrate veterans, I think something got lost in the translation when they changed it. And I confess that I have a bit of an obsession with World War I since I was a young history major in university. And I'm not entirely sure what about that war fascinated me so much, and frankly still does. Maybe it was the utter futility of it. But you know, memory's a funny thing. And it's funny sometimes what will spark an old memory that you haven't thought of for decades, perhaps. And while the choir was singing that beautiful, beautiful song, thank you, Jason. Thank you, choir. Thank you all so much. You know, sometimes music can spur a memory. And I suddenly flashed back to when I was a kid in the 60s. I loved the magazine National Geographic. Remember that? Yeah. And I remember one time I was leafing through an old National Geographic, and there was an article on the World War I Battle of Verdun. And the Battle of Verdun was one of the bloodiest and frankly stupidest battles ever. If I recall, more than 100,000 people died, and at the end of it, the front line had moved less than 100 yards. And I remember in the National Geographic, there were pictures of the battleground of Verdun today. Well, back in the 60s, I don't suppose it's changed. And you could still see all of the bomb craters, the shattered trees. There were parts of the battlefield that you couldn't visit because there was so much unexploded ordnance. And those pictures came back to me while the choir was singing. The utter futility of it. And when I was in university, somehow, no matter what history class I was in, I inevitably managed to make my term paper into something about World War I. I did a paper on the Battle of Verdun, and I did so much that when I was a senior and considering a topic for my baccalaureate thesis, my advisor, Sister Colette, said I had to write it on something else or get a new advisor. Because she was heartily sick and tired of reading about the First World War. See, she was old enough to have remembered it and to have lost friends and family in it. So she hadn't enjoyed it very much the first time, and reliving it through my papers was getting old, and I can't really say I blamed her. Because memories can be good or not so much. You may or may not have noticed that we actually do a lot of remembering in church. And there's an old hymn that I heard a lot when I was a kid growing up in the Baptist church, and sadly it conjures up a fairly painful memory for me. It's called "Tell Me the Old, Old Story." Do you know it, Jason? Good. And the gist of it is that as people of faith, we share the stories of our faith with one another so that we remember them. Tell me the old story of Jesus and his love, and that's a lovely memory. That, however, is not what I remember about it. See, as a kid, I confess that I took piano and organ lessons, and my father actually wanted me to be a professional musician. That ship sailed. Do not even think about asking me to play anything for you ever, because I've not really touched either instrument in, probably over 40 years. But back when I was a kid, someone got the bright idea that I should play them in church. So when I was about 8 or 9 years old and in vacation Bible school, our Sunday school teacher, Mrs. McDonald, insisted that I play this hymn for everyone to sing. It did not sound like that. Not when I played. And aside from the fact that at 8 or 9, that was really impressive, Jason. Google, bless you. Aside from the fact that at 8 or 9, I really was not very good to begin with, I was utterly terrified. See, I don't get stage fright getting up and speaking. I could stand up and preach to 10,000 people if y'all would just keep inviting your friends. But getting up and doing anything, even remotely musical, scares the poop out of me. And about 3 bars into the hymn, I started making mistakes. And I would try to stop and start over, but people kept singing while they weren't laughing at me. And Mrs. McDonald kept waving me to keep up, and it was a right disaster. So I don't play anymore. And that is a terrible memory. And I'm not sure quite why I went down that particular rabbit hole, except to say that in many respects, church is a place for memories, sometimes wonderful, sometimes not. And one of the times and places where we remember things most specifically is when we gather around this table. Because Jesus commanded us, "This do in remembrance of me." And some of the earliest Christian writers said that the best way to remember what happened at the Last Supper was to remember it as if we had actually been there, as if we were there at that table. And to remember Jesus in the bread and the cup now as if he were actually present. Christ has died, Christ is risen, Christ will come again. Christ is always with us. And when we remember, Christ is always with us. And this isn't strange. If you think about it, we actually do many things in remembrance of others. Me, I use my mother's good silver for ordinary meals with friends and family, and every time I remember her. And I sleep under my grandmother's quilts and remember her. And I wrote this sermon sitting in an oak roll-top desk that my father built, and I remember him. And when I get together with family, we talk about the rest of the kinfolk, both living and dead, and remember them. And the remembering is important to us. And in the remembering, I can access once again the love they gave me and the things I learned from them. So remembering is important. There's power in it, and there's love in remembering. And sometimes even there is grief in remembering. Memories can be bittersweet. And our lives are shaped by what we remember consciously and unconsciously. And most of all, our lives are shaped by how we interpret and apply those memories in the present. When we look back and remember our experiences, we can learn from them. Even when we learn from others' experiences, look back and remember our own history, we can learn. And Remembrance Day honors those who fought, believing in the possibility of a world without conflict. And for many, their sacrifice was a testament to their hope that future generations might live in peace. And this echoes the passage from Revelation that Catherine read, which envisions a renewed creation where death and division and destruction are no more. And so today, as we honor their memories, we also renew our commitment to their vision. And we hold on to the hope that in remembering, by God's grace, we can play a role in making a world where wars no longer claim lives, where communities live in peace, and where healing is extended to all. Let this be a day of remembering, but also a day of recommitment, where we not only honor the past, but actively work to build the world that the prophets and visionaries glimpsed, the world that so many have hoped and fought for, the world where God's love and justice dwell fully with us and within us. May we work toward that new heaven and new earth, living into the peace and promise of that new world as both our hope and our calling. Amen.